Dodge City, Kansas, 1881. Sheriff Wade Garrison stood on the courthouse steps reading the eviction notice to a woman who just lost everything. She slapped him hard enough to split his lip. He didn't flinch, just walked to his horse, opened his saddlebag, and pulled out something that changed both their lives forever.
Hello, compliments of the season. If you love heartwarming stories about life in times past, then you'd enjoy these stories. Comment where you're watching from, like and share these videos with loved ones as you enjoy them. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel too. My team and I have something free and beautiful for you once we hit the 1,000 subscriber mark. It will be shared in the community. You know, we go to great lengths to make these videos, and your support means a lot to us. Therefore, we plan to give back to you once we are able to, so be a part of what we are building.
Before we dive into Wade's story, let's talk about something most Western movies get wrong: what sheriffs actually did in the Old West. In the 1880s, sheriffs weren't just gunfighters keeping the peace. They were often the enforcement arm of banks and powerful businessmen. A huge part of their job, sometimes 60 to 70% of it, was serving legal papers, eviction notices, foreclosure orders, debt collection warrants. Towns like Dodge City were built on credit. Homesteaders borrowed to buy land. Business owners borrowed to build stores. When drought hit or cattle prices dropped or a breadwinner died, these debts became weapons, and sheriffs had no choice but to enforce them. Historical records show that between 1870 and 1970, over 40% of homesteads in Kansas failed due to foreclosure. Behind each statistic was a family losing everything, often to the same banks that had encouraged them to settle there in the first place. This created an impossible position for lawmen with conscience. The law said foreclose. Their hearts said this is wrong. Most chose the badge over their beliefs because, well, a man's got to eat. But every once in a while, someone chose differently. That's the world Wade Garrison lived in, a world where doing your job meant destroying lives, and where one moment of violence from a desperate widow would force him to finally answer the question he'd been avoiding for 11 years. What kind of man am I really? Let's find out what happened.
Wade Garrison had been sheriff of Dodge City for 11 years, and in all that time he'd never gotten used to evictions, especially not ones like this. The Fletcher house sat at the end of Front Street, a modest clapboard structure with a porch that sagged on one side and a garden that had gone to weeds. 3 months ago it had been a home. Now it was just another piece of property the bank wanted to sell. Wade climbed the courthouse steps that Tuesday morning with the notice folded in his coat pocket. The weight of it felt heavier than his badge. Judge Hollister had signed it yesterday. The bank, Dodge City Savings and Loan, owned by Cornelius Vance, had filed the foreclosure after Ruth Fletcher missed her third payment. Her husband, Thomas, had died in a mining accident up in Leadville 6 months back, left her with 2 young boys, a mortgage she couldn't pay, and debts that kept piling up like snow in a blizzard. Wade had tried to buy her time, gone to Vance personally, hat in hand, asked for an extension. Vance had smiled that thin smile of his and said the same thing he always said: "Business is business, Sheriff. Can't make exceptions or everyone will want one." Now Wade stood on Ruth Fletcher's porch, the notice in his hand, knowing that in 60 seconds he was going to destroy what little stability this woman had left. He knocked. The door opened. Ruth stood there in a faded calico dress, flour on her hands from baking. She was 32 but looked older, the way grief ages people faster than time. Her boys, Simon, 8, and Joseph, 6, peered around her skirt, eyes wide and cautious. "Mrs. Fletcher," Wade said quietly, "I'm sorry to disturb you." She looked at the paper in his hand. Her face went pale. "No, please, not yet." Wade's throat tightened. "I'm afraid the bank's given me no choice, ma'am. I have to read this official." "I just need 2 more weeks," Ruth said, her voice breaking. "I've got work lined up at the hotel, washing linens. Mrs. Pemberton said she'd pay me weekly. I can make the payment. I can—" "Mrs. Fletcher,
"Please!" Her eyes filled with tears. "This is my home, my boy's home. Thomas built this porch with his own hands. I can't, I won't." Wade looked down at the notice. The legal words blurred together. He'd read dozens of these over the years, but they never got easier. He cleared his throat and began reading. "By order of Judge Samuel Hollister and at the request of Dodge City Savings and Loan, you are hereby notified that this property located at—" The slap came so fast he didn't see it coming. Ruth's hand connected with his face hard enough to snap his head sideways. His lip split. Blood filled his mouth, warm and copper-tasting. The boys gasped. One of them started crying. Ruth stood there, hand still raised, chest heaving. Tears streamed down her face. Damn you, and damn this town, and damn every man who hides behind a piece of paper instead of doing what's right." Wade touched his lip. Blood came away on his fingers. He didn't speak, didn't arrest her for assaulting an officer, didn't even flinch. He just folded the notice carefully, tucked it back in his pocket, and turned away. Behind him, Ruth collapsed against the doorframe, sobbing. Wade walked down the porch steps, his boots heavy on the wood. The whole street had gone quiet. People stood in doorways, watching. News traveled fast in Dodge City. By sundown, everyone would know the widow Fletcher had slapped the sheriff. Wade didn't care. He walked to where his horse, a gray gelding named Suit, stood tied at the hitching post. His face burned where she'd hit him, but the pain in his chest burned hotter. He reached for his saddlebag.
Wade's hands shook slightly as he unbuckled the worn leather saddlebag. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from dust and weather, was a book. Not just any book, a ledger. Brown leather cover, pages filled with his own careful handwriting. 11 years of entries. He'd started keeping it his first month as sheriff. Every act of injustice he'd been forced to enforce because the law said so. Every eviction, every arrest of a desperate man stealing food for his family. Every time he'd had to choose between his badge and his conscience, and the badge had won. Wade had told himself he was keeping a record, documentation, something to show that he'd tried, that he'd cared, even when his hands were tied. But that was a lie. He'd kept the ledger because he was a coward, because writing down his shame was easier than actually doing something about it. He flipped through the pages now, there on the street, blood still dripping from his split lip, found the entry from 3 days ago when he'd talked to Vance about Ruth Fletcher. August 14th, 1881. Asked C. Vance for extension on Fletcher property. Denied. Vance claims bank policy. I believe it's cruelty, but law is law. I will serve the notice Tuesday. The words stared back at him, neat and precise. Coward's words. A man documenting injustice instead of fighting it. Wade looked up at Ruth's house. She was still in the doorway, her boys clinging to her. Her hand was probably stinging from the slap. His face certainly was, but he deserved worse than a slap. He deserved what he was about to give himself. Wade closed the ledger, tucked it under his arm, and untied Soot from the hitching post. He swung into the saddle, turned the horse toward the center of town, and rode slowly down Front Street. People watched from windows, from porches, from the boardwalk. The sheriff, with blood on his face and a book under his arm, riding like a man going to his own hanging. He stopped in front of the Dodge City Savings and Loan. The bank was a 2-story brick building that Cornelius Vance had built 5 years ago when the cattle trade was booming. It dominated the street like a monument to greed, all sharp corners and cold stone. Wade dismounted, tied Soot to the rail, and walked through the front door. The bank was cool inside, a relief from the August heat. Cornelius Vance sat at a massive oak desk in the back corner, reviewing papers. He was 53, well-fed, with silver hair and a suit that cost more than most men in Dodge City earned in a year. He looked up when Wade entered, saw the blood on the sheriff's face, and smiled. "Didn't go well, I take it?" Vance said. Wade walked straight to the desk, set the ledger down, hard. "What's this?" Vance asked, eyeing the book with amusement. 11 years, Wade said. His voice was quiet, but something in it made Vance's smile falter. 11 years of every eviction, every foreclosure, every time you've used the law to steal from people too poor to fight back. Vance's expression hardened. I don't steal, Sheriff. I operate within the law. If people can't pay their debts. Thomas Fletcher died in a mining cave-in, left his widow with 2 boys and a mortgage. She's been trying to pay, working herself to the bone, but you wouldn't give her 2 more weeks. Why should I? Vance leaned back in his chair. Sentiment doesn't pay debts, Garson. Neither does hard work if it doesn't produce results. The woman can't pay. The bank has a right to reclaim its property. Its property? Wade repeated. That house was Thomas Fletcher's dream. He built it himself, raised his family there, and now you're taking it because her widow can't come up with $67. Vance's eyes narrowed. How do you know the exact amount? Because I looked at the records, asked your clerk. $67. That's all that stands between Ruth Fletcher and homelessness. $67 to a man who owns half this town. If I forgive her debt, I'll have 50 people asking for the same. I run a business, not a charity. You run a machine that grinds people into dust, and I've been the hand that turns the wheel. He opened the ledger, flipped to a page from 2 years ago. Martin Hendricks, farmer south of town. Drought killed his crops. You foreclosed on his land, sold it to the railroad for 3 times what he owed. He hung himself in his barn. Vance's jaw tightened. That's not. Wade flipped to another page. The Donovan family, Irish immigrants. You loaned them money at 15% interest, knowing they couldn't read the contract. When they couldn't pay, you took their business. They left town with nothing. Sheriff. Wade's voice was shaking now, not with fear, with rage he'd been swallowing for 11 years. I enforced every one of these, knocked on every door, read every notice, told myself I was just doing my job, following the law. He closed the ledger. But the law is just words on paper, and words can be changed by men who have the courage to change them. Vance stood, his face flushed. Are you threatening me? No, Wade said. He unpinned his badge, the 5-pointed star he'd worn for 11 years, and set it on the desk next to the ledger. I'm quitting. The word hung in the air like gun smoke. Vance stared at the badge. You can't quit. I just did. The town council won't allow it. We have an agreement. The agreement was that I'd enforce the law, but I won't enforce injustice anymore. Not for you, not for anyone. He turned to leave. Garson, Vance's voice was sharp. You walk out that door without your badge, you're just another nobody. No authority, no power, no protection. You think people will respect you? You think you'll find work? You'll be finished in this town. Wade stopped at the door, looked back. I've been finished for 11 years, he said quietly. I just didn't have the courage to admit it until a widow slapped some sense into me. He walked out.
The street was crowded. Word had spread that something was happening at the bank. People lined the boardwalks, watching. Wade emerged into the sunlight, no badge on his chest, blood drying on his chin. He felt lighter than he had in years, and more terrified. He'd just thrown away everything he'd built, his position, his salary, his authority, all of it gone in a moment of clarity that might have been courage or might have been madness. Wade untied suit and led the horse down Front Street on foot. He didn't mount, didn't hurry, just walked like a man who'd finally stopped running from himself. A voice called out from the crowd. "Sheriff!" Old Henry Burkett, the blacksmith. "What happened? Why'd you give up your badge?" Wade stopped, looked at the crowd of faces, his neighbors, the people he'd sworn to protect. "Because I've been protecting the wrong people," he said simply. He kept walking, past the Long Branch Saloon where drovers and gamblers watched from the windows, past the general store where Clara Ashby stood with her arms crossed, shaking her head.
past the butcher, the tailor, the newspaper office where Edmund Pope was already scribbling notes for tomorrow's edition. Wade reached Ruth Fletcher's house and stopped. She was sitting on the porch steps now, her boys beside her. Her eyes were red from crying. When she saw him, she stood up quickly, fear flashing across her face. "I'm sorry," she said, the words tumbling out. "I shouldn't have hit you. I was just so angry and scared and—" "You had every right," Wade said. He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. Inside was everything he'd saved over the past 2 years, $340. He'd been saving for a piece of land north of town, a place to retire someday, build a house, maybe start a life that didn't involve enforcing other people's cruelty. That dream was gone now, but maybe this was a better one. "What is this?" Ruth asked as he held out the envelope. "Enough to pay off your mortgage and have some left over," Wade said. "Take it." Ruth stared at the envelope like it might burn her. "I can't accept this." "Why not?" "Because it's charity, because I don't deserve—" "You deserve a hell of a lot more than this town's given you," Wade said. His voice was gentle but firm. "Your husband died working himself to death to provide. You've been doing the same. This isn't charity, it's justice, the kind the law should provide but doesn't." Tears spilled down Ruth's cheeks. "I'll pay you back." "I don't want you to. I will anyway." Ruth took the envelope with shaking hands. "Even if it takes years." Wade smiled for the first time that day. "Then I guess I'll be seeing you around." He tipped his hat to her and turned to leave. "Mr. Garrison," Ruth's voice stopped him. He looked back. "Thank you," she said. "Not just for this, for being willing to change." Wade nodded, couldn't speak. The lump in his throat was too big. He mounted Soot and rode away. By nightfall, the whole town knew what Wade Garrison had done. Quit his job, given his life savings to the widow Fletcher, walked away from everything. Opinions were divided. Some called him a fool, a man who'd thrown away a good position for sentiment, who'd put one woman's needs above the stability of the town. The bank needed a strong sheriff to enforce its claims, they said. Without that, chaos would follow. Others called him something else, a man of principle, the first person to choose courage over comfort. That night, Wade sat in the boarding house room he'd rented, small, sparse, all he could afford now, and wondered if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. A knock came at his door. He opened it to find Edmund Pope, editor of the Dodge City Times. Edmund was 35, thin as a rail, with ink-stained fingers and eyes that missed nothing. "May I come in?" Edmund asked. Wade stepped aside. Edmund entered, looked around the bare room, and set a newspaper on the small table, tomorrow's edition, still wet with ink. The headline read, "Sheriff Chooses Conscience Over Career." Below it, Edmund had written the whole story, the eviction notice, the slap, Wade's resignation, the gift to Ruth Fletcher, every detail laid out in prose that was simple but powerful. "Why?" Wade asked. "Because someone needed to say it," Edmund replied. "This town has been letting Vance and men like him run roughshod over decent people for too long. You stood up. Someone needed to document that." Wade read the article. Edmund hadn't exaggerated or sensationalized, just told the truth. "This will make you enemies," Wade said. "I know," Edmund smiled, "but it might make some friends, too." He left. Wade sat alone, reading the article again. The words felt strange, like he was reading about someone else, some version of himself he'd always wanted to be, but never had the courage to become. Until today.
3 days later, Wade was chopping wood behind the boarding house when a rider approached. A young man, maybe 20, with a badge on his chest. Deputy Carson Miller, who'd worked under Wade for 2 years. Carson dismounted, looking uncomfortable. "Sheriff," he stopped. "Sorry, Mr. Garrison. The town council wants to see you." Wade set down the axe. "What for?" "They didn't say. Just asked me to fetch you." Wade wiped sweat from his forehead. "Tell him I'm busy."
"Please, sir, they were real insistent." Something in Carson's tone made Wade reconsider. He washed his hands, put on a clean shirt, and followed the deputy to the town hall. The council met in a room above the courthouse. 5 men sat around a long table. Mayor Thaddeus Crane at the head, flanked by business owners and prominent citizens. Cornelius Vance sat at the far end, his face unreadable. "Mr. Garrison," Mayor Crane said, "thank you for coming." Wade stood near the door. "What's this about?" "We've been discussing the situation," Crane said carefully. "Your resignation has created a difficult position for the town. We need a sheriff. Deputy Miller is capable, but he's young, inexperienced. We've had 3 applications from outsiders, but none we trust." Wade said nothing. Crane cleared his throat. "We'd like to offer you your position back." Wade looked at Vance. The banker's expression was stone. "With conditions," Crane added quickly. "You would continue to enforce the law as written, evictions, arrests, all of it, but we would also establish a town fund for families in crisis, administered by the council. It wouldn't solve everything, but it would provide some flexibility." "A fund," Wade repeated. "Financed by increased business taxes. Nothing substantial, just enough to help a few people in genuine need." It was a compromise, a small one, barely a crack in the wall of indifference that surrounded people like Ruth Fletcher. But it was something. Wade looked at each council member. Most avoided his eyes. They were scared of change, scared of what would happen if they did nothing, scared of men like Wade who reminded them that comfort came at a cost. "No," Wade said. "Blink? I'm sorry?" "I said no." Wade's voice was calm. "I appreciate the offer. I appreciate the fund. It's a good start. But I can't go back to being the man who knocks on doors and delivers bad news because the law says so." "Then what will you do?" Crane asked. Wade smiled. "I'm going to do what I should have done 11 years ago." He turned and walked out. Wade used the last of his money to rent a small office on a side street, just 1 room with a desk, 2 chairs, and a window that looked out on the alley. He hung a simple sign outside, "Wade Garrison, Advocate." He wasn't a lawyer, didn't have formal training, but he had 11 years of experience watching the law crush people who couldn't fight back. And he had something more valuable than a law degree. He had nothing left to lose. His first client was Ruth Fletcher. She came to him a week after paying off her mortgage, her face tight with worry. "The bank is saying I owe back taxes, 3 years' worth. I didn't even know. Thomas always handled that, and after he died, I forgot." Wade looked at the notice she'd brought. It was real, legal, and it totaled more than she'd just paid off. "How much time do you have?" 30 days, or they seize the property anyway." Wade spent that night in the courthouse basement going through tax records by lamplight. What he found made his blood boil. The taxes were real, but so was something else. Thomas Fletcher had filed for a veteran's exemption. He'd served in the Army during the border conflicts. That exemption reduced his tax burden by 70%, but someone at the tax office, someone who happened to be Vance's cousin, had lost the paperwork after Thomas died. Wade brought the original exemption certificate to the tax assessor the next morning, found it in the military records office, dusty but legal. The back taxes were reduced to $11. Ruth Fletcher cried when Wade told her, "How can I ever repay you?" "Tell people," Wade said. "Tell them there's someone willing to fight." She did. Within a month, Wade had 10 clients, then 20, people who'd been cheated, overlooked, crushed by systems they didn't understand. He didn't charge much, couldn't afford to, but he didn't need much, just enough to eat and pay rent. The work was harder than being sheriff, required more thought, more research, more courage. But it also required something else. It required him to look at himself in the mirror and not feel ashamed.
6 months passed. Winter came to Dodge City, cold and sharp. Wade's practice grew. He won some cases, lost others, but every fight mattered. Every person he helped was a small crack in the foundation of injustice. And Cornelius Vance noticed. The banker's power was built on people's silence, their acceptance, their belief that fighting was useless. Wade was teaching them otherwise. In January, Vance called in debts on 3 of Wade's clients simultaneously, demanded immediate payment. When they couldn't pay, he filed for foreclosure and seizure of assets. It was a message. "Stop, or I'll destroy everyone you're trying to help." Wade didn't stop. He organized the three families to file a joint complaint with the territorial governor, documented Vance's pattern of predatory lending, got Edmund Pope to publish it in the Times. The governor sent an investigator. Vance was furious. He confronted Wade in the street one February morning in front of half the town. "You're trying to destroy me," Vance said, his face red with rage. "No," Wade replied calmly, "I'm trying to stop you from destroying other people." "I've done nothing illegal." "Legal and right aren't always the same thing," Wade's voice carried across the street. "You've used the law as a weapon, hurt people who couldn't defend themselves. I'm just teaching them how to fight back." Vance stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You were nothing before I helped get you that sheriff position. I can make you nothing again." Wade looked at him, really looked, saw past the expensive suit and the bluster to the frightened man underneath, a man who'd built his entire identity on power over others, who couldn't stand the thought of losing it. "You can't make me nothing," Wade said quietly, "because I've already been nothing. I spent 11 years being a hollow man with a badge, enforcing your cruelty. That was nothing. This," he gestured at the small office, at the people watching from the boardwalks, "this is something." Vance had no response. He turned and walked away. The investigator's report came back 3 weeks later. No illegal activity found, but recommendations for tighter lending regulations and oversight. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. Spring came. Wade Garrison stood in Ruth Fletcher's garden, helping her plant tomatoes. Her boys ran circles around them, laughing. The house was hers now, free and clear. She'd started taking in sewing work, was making enough to save a little each month. "I'm thinking of expanding the garden," Ruth said, patting dirt around a seedling. "Maybe selling vegetables at the market." "You should," Wade said. She looked at him. "I never thanked you properly for everything." "You thank me every time you don't give up. That's enough." A rider approached, Deputy Miller. He'd become sheriff after Wade refused the position a second time. He was doing good work, learning that the badge meant service, not power. "Mr. Garrison," Carson said, dismounting, "got someone who wants to see you." An older man climbed down from the deputy's horse, weathered face, calloused hands, a farmer from the look of him. "Name's Albert Hutchins. Got a place 30 miles south. The bank's trying to take it. Heard you might be able to help." Wade looked at Ruth. She smiled and nodded. "I'll do what I can," Wade said. That evening he sat in his office as the sun set, reviewing Albert Hutchins's paperwork. The same pattern: predatory loan, hidden fees, a family's dream turned into a banker's profit. Wade opened his ledger, the same one he'd kept as sheriff, but now, instead of recording injustices he'd enforced, he documented ones he'd fought. Each case, each family, each small victory against systems built to crush the powerless. The entries filled page after page. He thought about the day Ruth Fletcher had slapped him, how her hand connecting with his face had felt like waking from a long sleep, how walking to his saddlebag, pulling out that ledger, had been the first step on a path he was still walking. He'd lost his badge, his savings, his comfortable life, but he'd found something better: purpose. Wade closed the ledger and looked out the window. Dodge City stretched before him in the gathering darkness, imperfect, unjust, but also full of people trying to survive, trying to hold on to dignity in a world that seemed designed to strip it away. He couldn't save everyone, but he could fight for them. And that was enough. A widow had slapped a sheriff, and in that moment of violence and pain and righteous anger, 2 lives had changed forever. Hers toward hope, his toward redemption. Wade Garrison smiled in the darkness. Tomorrow he'd fight Albert Hutchins's case,
The day after, someone else's. On and on, as long as he had breath. He'd been a lawman who enforced injustice. Now, he was just a man who fought against it. And for the first time in 11 years, when he looked in the mirror, he recognized the face staring back. If this story moved you, if Wade's journey from hollow lawman to purposeful advocate stirred something in your chest, then subscribe. We bring you tales of courage, redemption, and ordinary people choosing to do extraordinary things when the world makes it easier to look away. Don't miss the next story. Subscribe now.
If you enjoyed this latest story on life in the Old Wild West, then I'm sure you will love the next one coming up. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you can get updates on time. Did I tell you we post new, exciting, heartwarming stories daily? Subscribe now to join us so you won't miss any new stories.